Welcome to the Premier Mindset by Premier Performance LLC. I'm your host, Trent Mailer, LCSW, licensed clinical therapist and performance coach, and this is episode 66. I want to start with a question. What if the best thing that ever happened to you already happened? Not because it had to, not because you reached your potential, not because you exhausted what you were capable of becoming, but because you stopped growing after it happened. Think about that for a second. What if your greatest achievement, your greatest confidence, your greatest sense of belonging, your greatest sense of significance, your greatest feeling of being alive happened when you were 17 years old? For a lot of people, that question is uncomfortable. For others, it feels terrifying because deep down, there are people walking around right now who have jobs, families, responsibilities, houses, careers, businesses, and entire adult lives built around one uncomfortable reality. The most exciting chapter of their life happened decades ago. When most people hear the phrase peaked in high school, they laugh. They think about the former athlete still wearing the Letterman jacket, the person still talking about the game-winning touchdown, the individual who somehow finds a way to bring up high school achievements in every conversation. But I think that definition is too shallow because peaking in high school isn't really about high school. It's about psychological attachment. It's about becoming emotionally dependent on a version of yourself that no longer exists. And that problem is far more common than most people realize. Quick note before we dive in, this podcast is for education and performance growth. It's not a replacement for therapy or medical treatment. If there's something you need, make sure you go and get it. On top of that, we have all of our social media accounts linked in the episode description below. So make sure to get involved and get engaged in those social media accounts as we continue to put things out and growing those communities. Now let's get back into it. I've worked with athletes, I've worked with executives, I've worked with business owners, I've worked with high performers from all kinds of backgrounds. One thing I've noticed is that people rarely get stuck. They lack capability. They get stuck because they become attached to certainty. They become attached to an identity that once worked. They become attached to a chapter where they knew exactly who they were. High school often provides something many adults spend years trying to recreate: structure, status, belonging, predictability, a scoreboard. You knew where you stood. You knew who your friends were. You knew what success looked like. You knew what your role was. Then life changes. The structure disappears. The certainty disappears. The scoreboard disappears. Now you're competing in environments where the rules aren't always obvious, where progress is slower, where feedback is less immediate, where nobody hands you a schedule, where nobody tells you exactly what to do next. That's where a lot of people get stuck. Not because they can't grow, because growth suddenly becomes uncomfortable. Let me paint a picture. Imagine a former athlete. In high school, he was the guy, team captain, all-conference player, popular, respected. People knew his name. Friday nights felt electric. There was purpose, direction, identity. Then graduation came. A few years passed. The sport ended. The crowds disappeared. The attention disappeared. Life became ordinary. Now he's sitting at work, same desk, same routine, same conversations, same weeks repeating themselves. And every once in a while, someone asks about high school. Suddenly, his energy changes. His posture changes. His eyes light up. Because for a brief moment, he gets to revisit the last time he truly felt significant. That is not a sports problem. That is not a nostalgia problem. That is an identity problem. Because when your greatest source of confidence exists in the past, the future starts feeling threatening. Growth requires uncertainty. Growth requires risk. Growth requires the possibility that you might fail publicly. Many people would rather protect an old victory than risk discovering they are capable of something greater. And that is where stagnation begins. Not with failure, with comfort. Comfort is one of the most misunderstood threats to performance. Most people think danger comes from adversity. Often the greater danger comes from stability, because adversity forces adaptation. Comfort invites complacency. Comfort whispers, you've done enough. You've already proven yourself. Why risk it? Why put yourself out there again? Why become a beginner? Why start over? And if you're not careful, 10 years pass, then 20, then 30, and your life becomes a museum dedicated to a previous version of yourself. That is why one of the most important tools I use with clients is what I call the current scoreboard audit. Not the scoreboard from 5 years ago, not the scoreboard from college, not the scoreboard from high school, the current scoreboard. If someone removed every accomplishment from your past, what evidence would exist that you're still growing today? That question hits hard because many people are living off psychological interest earned from achievements they haven't added to in years. They're consuming confidence that was generated by an earlier version of themselves. They're not building new confidence. They're spending old confidence. There's a massive difference. Real confidence is created through current evidence, current growth, current challenges, current development, current expansion, not memories. And that's where this conversation becomes relevant for high performers, because high performers are not immune to peaking. In many ways, they're more vulnerable to it. Success can become a trap, especially early success. When something works, we naturally want to preserve it. We want to protect it. We want to maintain it. But the mindset that creates success is often different from the mindset required to sustain growth. The person who keeps evolving is willing to repeatedly leave certainty behind. They're willing to outgrow old identities. They're willing to become inexperienced again. They're willing to look foolish in pursuit of becoming exceptional. The person who peaks becomes a protector. The person who grows becomes an explorer. One protects the past, the other builds the future. And here's the uncomfortable truth. The most dangerous thing about peaking in high school is not that high school was great. It's that you spend the next 20 years trying not to lose an argument with your own past. You spend years trying to prove that version of you still matters, trying to prove you still have it, trying to prove that those were not your best days, trying to defend a chapter instead of writing a new one. Meanwhile, life keeps moving. Opportunities keep moving. Growth keeps moving. The future keeps moving. And eventually the gap between who you are capable of becoming and who you currently are becomes impossible to ignore. That gap creates frustration, restlessness, regret, not because life treated you unfairly, because you stopped investing in your own evolution. Another tool I want you to think about is what I call the growth gap assessment. Ask yourself, what am I currently doing that would make my future self proud? Not my past self, my future self. What skills am I building? What challenges am I pursuing? What risks am I taking? What discomfort am I voluntarily embracing? Because growth leaves evidence. Expansion leaves evidence. Evolution leaves evidence. And if that evidence doesn't exist, the problem is rarely potential. The problem is usually avoidance. Avoidance disguised as comfort. Avoidance disguised as stability. Avoidance disguised as satisfaction. The highest performing people I've ever worked with have one thing in common. They refuse to let a previous chapter become the final chapter. They understand something most people don't. A good chapter can be just as dangerous as a bad one. Because bad chapters create urgency, good chapters create attachment. And attachment is often what keeps people from becoming who they're capable of becoming next. That's where I want to take this conversation next. Because peaking in high school doesn't stay contained to personal growth. It starts affecting relationships, leadership, performance, identity, and eventually it impacts every room you walk into. Because the moment growth stops, something else takes its place. And that something is rarely positive. The problem with peaking in high school is not that it traps you in the past. The problem is that it eventually starts influencing your future. Most people think stagnation is a personal issue. It isn't. Stagnation spreads. It's contagious. It affects relationships. It affects leadership. It affects parenting. It affects teams. It affects organizations. It affects every environment where influence exists. Because the moment someone stops growing, they begin seeing growth differently. Growth becomes threatening. Expansion becomes uncomfortable. Innovation becomes disruptive. The success of other people becomes irritating, not because they're bad people, because every reminder of someone else's growth becomes a reminder of their own stagnation. And that creates tension, a lot of tension. Think about what happens psychologically when someone's identity becomes tied to a previous version of themselves. They no longer evaluate life based on possibility. They evaluate life based on preservation. Every decision starts becoming defensive. Every decision starts becoming protective. Their goals shift from becoming more to losing less. That is a dangerous transition because performance-driven people do not decline overnight. They decline gradually. First, they stop taking risks. Then they stop pursuing discomfort. Then they stop learning. Then they stop evolving. Then eventually they start explaining why growth isn't necessary. And that's usually where the rationalizations begin. I'm happy where I am. I've already accomplished enough. I don't need all that. Those things aren't important. Sometimes those statements are true. Many times they are defense mechanisms. The difference comes down to one question. Did you consciously choose your current life, or did fear slowly choose it for you? Those are not the same thing. One is intentional, the other is surrender disguised as comfort. And here's where this starts affecting other people. Imagine a leadership team sitting around a conference table. Revenue has started flattening, performance is slowing, market conditions are changing. The younger members of the team begin bringing new ideas forward, new strategies, new technology, new approaches, new ways of thinking. Across the table sits the senior leader. For years, this individual was successful, respected, highly capable. They built something meaningful. The room knows it. The organization knows it. Their history deserves respect. But something has changed. Every suggestion is met with resistance. Every innovation gets dismissed. Every new idea gets explained away. Not because the ideas are bad, because the ideas threaten the identity that leader built around being right. The discussion gets tense. One team member pushes back, the leader becomes defensive. The conversation becomes emotional. People stop speaking openly. The meeting ends. Nothing changes. Everyone leaves frustrated, and the organization stays stuck. Most people watching that scene would say the problem is leadership. I would argue the problem started much earlier. The problem started when identity stopped evolving. Because when identity becomes rigid, curiosity disappears. And curiosity is one of the most important predictors of long-term growth. The highest performers I've ever worked with maintain something that most people lose: intellectual flexibility. They remain coachable, they remain teachable, they remain adaptable. They remain willing to be wrong. The moment someone becomes more committed to protecting their reputation than expanding their capability, growth starts dying. And that principle applies far beyond business. It applies in relationships too. One of the most common consequences of peaking early is comparison. Not occasional comparison, constant comparison. Life gets measured against a chapter that can never be recreated. Every experience gets evaluated against the emotional intensity of the past. Every achievement gets compared against old victories. Every season gets compared against a version of life that existed under completely different circumstances. That comparison creates a problem because reality can never compete with a memory that has been edited for 20 years. Memories become polished. The hard part disappears. The struggles disappear. The uncertainty disappears. Only the highlights remain. Eventually, people stop comparing themselves to reality. They're comparing themselves to a highlight reel. And nobody wins that comparison. This is where I often introduce what I call the identity update process. Most people update their phones more frequently than they update their identity. Think about that. Your responsibilities evolve. Your opportunities evolve. Your relationships evolve. Your skills evolve. The world evolves. But many people are operating from a self-concept that was built 10, 15, 20 years ago. And at some point you have to ask, who am I today? Not who was I? Not who did people expect me to become? Not who did I used to be? Who am I right now? Who am I building right now? What am I becoming right now? Because identity should be a living system, not a historical monument. The strongest leaders understand this. The strongest performers understand this. They continuously update their self-concept. They refuse to become prisoners of previous success. And that takes courage, because every identity update requires letting go of something. Sometimes it's certainty, sometimes it's ego, sometimes it's status, sometimes it's familiarity, sometimes it's the comfort of being known for something. That's why growth feels threatening. Growth requires death, not physical death, identity death. Parts of you must end so stronger parts of you can emerge. Most people understand that concept intellectually. Very few people practice it intentionally. And when they don't, another dangerous pattern emerges: resentment. You see it all the time. People who stopped growing often become critics of people who are growing. The entrepreneur gets criticized. The athlete gets criticized. The leader gets criticized. The person pursuing something meaningful gets criticized. People assume those criticisms are about the target. Often, they're not. Often they're expressions of unresolved regret. Because watching someone else expand forces you to confront areas where you've contracted. Watching someone else evolve forces you to confront areas where you've remained the same. Growth creates mirrors. Not everyone likes what they see in them. This is why one of the most valuable filters I've found is what I call the legacy versus ego filter. Whenever you're making an important decision, ask yourself, is this decision serving my future or is it protecting my ego? Those answers are often very different. The ego wants comfort. The ego wants certainty. The ego wants validation. The ego wants familiarity. Legacy wants growth. Legacy wants expansion. Legacy wants contribution. The ego is obsessed with proving. Legacy is obsessed with building. And the people who peak early almost always get trapped in proving. They spend years proving they were important, proving they mattered, proving they were talented, proving they were special. Meanwhile, the people who continue growing are building skills, building relationships, building businesses, building impact, building character, building capability, building futures. One group protects history, the other creates it. And this is the reality that many people never confront. The people who peak early rarely lose because they aren't talented enough. They lose because they become loyal to who they were instead of committed to who they could become. That sentence is worth sitting with. Because loyalty is usually considered a positive trait. But loyalty to an outdated identity can become one of the most destructive forces in a person's life. You can become so loyal to who you used to be that you never become who you're capable of becoming. You can become so attached to an old chapter that you stop writing new ones. You can become so committed to preserving significance that you stop creating it. And eventually, stagnation becomes contagious. It spreads into teams. It spreads into families. It spreads into organizations. It spreads into cultures. People take their cues from you. They watch how you respond to growth. They watch how you respond to uncertainty. They watch how you respond to change. And if you resist evolution, eventually the people around you start resisting it too. And that's when the stakes become much larger than your own life. Because now your unwillingness to grow is limiting the growth of others. That's where we're going next. Because awareness alone is not enough. Recognizing stagnation is important. Understanding the consequences is important. But neither one solves the problem. The real question becomes, how do people break free from identities that no longer serve them? How do they rebuild momentum after years of comfort? How do they stop protecting old successes and start creating new ones? Because growth is not something that happens accidentally. It is something that must be engineered. And that's where we're headed next. At this point in the conversation, we need to address something uncomfortable. Most people say they want growth. Very few people actually want what growth requires. Because growth sounds exciting when you're imagining the outcome. Growth feels very different when you're experiencing the process. The process is uncertainty. The process is incompetence. The process is risk. The process is walking into rooms where you no longer are the most impressive person there. And that is exactly why so many people become trapped by old successes. Not because they lack ambition, because they become addicted to competence. Think about that. A person who peaked in high school is often protecting something much deeper than a memory. They're protecting certainty. They're protecting the last environment where they knew exactly who they were. The last environment where they understood the rules. The last environment where they knew how to win. The last environment where they felt important. The moment they step into a new challenge, all of that disappears. Now they're a beginner again. Now they're uncomfortable again. Now they can fail again. Now they can be judged. And for many people, that's terrifying because their identity was built around being successful, not around becoming successful. Those are different things. Successful people enjoy outcomes. Growing people enjoy development. One creates stagnation, the other creates evolution. And this is where the psychology becomes incredibly important because the human brain is designed to preserve identity, not expand it. Your brain wants consistency. It wants predictability. It wants familiarity. It wants yesterday to look like today from a survival perspective. That makes sense. From a performance perspective, it's a disaster because every meaningful level of growth requires you to become unfamiliar with yourself. Every promotion, every business expansion, every new leadership role, every major life transition, every significant achievement, it requires a version of you that does not yet exist. And that's where many people stop. Not because they can't grow, because growth creates identity friction. The old version of you starts fighting for survival. You hear it in the language people use. This isn't really me. I don't know if I'm cut out for that. I've never been that kind of person. I don't want to look stupid. I don't want to start over. Those statements sound logical, but they're often identity preservation mechanisms. The brain attempting to keep you inside familiar territory because familiar feels safe, even when familiar is limiting. One of the most effective exercises I use with high performers is what I call expansion tracking. Most people track outcomes, revenue, wins, promotions, achievements. Expansion tracking measures something different. It measures exposure. How often are you deliberately placing yourself in situations that require growth? How often are you entering rooms where you are not the most capable person? How often are you attempting something that creates uncertainty? How often are you stretching your current identity? Because growth rarely happens through achievement alone. Growth happens through exposure. A person can spend 10 years repeating the same year of life over and over. The calendar moves, but the individual doesn't. Expansion tracking forces honesty because it answers a simple question. Am I actually growing or am I simply getting older? Those are not the same thing. And if we're being honest, many people mistake aging for development. They assume experience automatically creates wisdom. It doesn't. Repeated experience creates repetition. Intentional reflection creates wisdom. Huge difference. The next mechanism is one that almost nobody talks about. Your nervous system develops preferences. Not just your mind, your nervous system. The longer you live inside comfort, predictability, and familiarity, the more foreign challenge begins to feel, which means discomfort starts getting interpreted as danger. This is why people often quit growth opportunities early. Not because the opportunity is wrong, because discomfort feels threatening. Their nervous system has lost familiarity with expansion. This is where discomfort scheduling becomes incredibly valuable. Instead of waiting for growth opportunities to appear, you can deliberately create them. You schedule exposure. You schedule learning. You schedule challenge. You schedule situations that force adaptation. Maybe it's public speaking. Maybe it's networking. Maybe it's launching something. Maybe it's taking on a difficult leadership project. Maybe it's pursuing a goal that carries a real possibility of failure. The activity matters less than the principle. You're training your nervous system to normalize growth. You're teaching yourself that discomfort is information, not danger. And the people who continue evolving throughout life become incredibly skilled at this. They stop interpreting discomfort as evidence they should retreat. They start interpreting discomfort as evidence they're expanding. That's a radically different relationship with growth. Now there's another trap that catches high performers specifically: achievement dependency. This one is sneaky because achievement dependency often looks like ambition, but they're not the same thing. Ambition says, I want to build something meaningful. Achievement dependency says, I need achievement to feel valuable. One creates growth, the other creates emotional fragility. Because if your identity requires achievement to survive, eventually you'll stop taking risks. Why? Because failure becomes too expensive psychologically. You start protecting your image instead of pursuing development. You start managing perception instead of pursuing progress. You start avoiding situations where you might not immediately succeed. And that is the exact opposite of growth. High performers who continue evolving understand something important. They don't attach their values to outcomes. They attach their value to engagement, to effort, to development, to becoming. That's why they can repeatedly start over. That's why they can enter new industries. That's why they can reinvent themselves. That's why they can continue growing decades after everyone else has stopped. Because they understand that being a beginner isn't a threat. It's a requirement. I remember periods in my own life where comfort became incredibly tempting. Not because I lacked goals, because things were working. The routine felt predictable. The path felt familiar. The expectations felt manageable. And that's often where growth becomes most dangerous. Not when things are falling apart, when things are going well. Because success creates comfort. Comfort creates complacency. Complacency creates stagnation. And stagnation is almost never obvious in the beginning. It feels earned. It feels responsible. It feels reasonable. It feels justified. You tell yourself you're maintaining. You tell yourself you're taking a break. You tell yourself you've done enough. Months pass, then years pass, then one day you realize you're no longer becoming. You're simply preserving. That realization can be painful, but it's incredibly valuable because awareness creates choice, and choice creates change. One of the most powerful shifts a person can make is moving from outcome goals to identity goals. Instead of asking, what do I want to accomplish? Start asking, who do I need to become? That question changes everything because outcomes eventually expire. Identity compounds. A promotion expires, an award expires, recognition expires. But the person capable of creating those things continues producing. That's why future identity construction becomes so important. Stop building goals around achievement alone. Build goals around evolution. Create a detailed vision of the person you need to become over the next 3 years. Not the things you want, the person you must become. How do they think? How do they communicate? How do they lead? How do they handle adversity? How do they invest in themselves? How do they spend their time? How do they show up when nobody is watching? Now you're not chasing outcomes. You're constructing identity. And identity drives behavior. Behavior drives results. This brings us to one of the biggest distinctions between people who continue growing and people who peak early. The people who continue growing repeatedly enter skill acquisition cycles. They never stop learning. They never stop developing. They never stop becoming students. They intentionally become beginners again. Think about that. The very thing most people avoid is the thing that protects long-term greatness. Beginners struggle. Beginners fail. Beginners look awkward. Beginners make mistakes. Yet high performers voluntarily return to that state over and over and over again. Why? Because they understand something that stagnant people don't. Temporary incompetence is the admission price for future mastery. You cannot grow without paying it. You cannot evolve without paying it. You cannot build a remarkable life without paying it. The question is not whether you'll experience discomfort. The question is whether you're willing to use discomfort strategically. Because growth is not accidental. Growth is engineered. Growth is scheduled. Growth is measured. Growth is reinforced. And that leads us into the final part of this conversation. Because once someone understands how to rebuild growth, a bigger question emerges. Not how to avoid peaking, not how to keep improving, but how to create a life where your greatest years are always ahead of you. Because ultimately, this conversation is not about high school. It's about legacy. It's about who you become over decades. It's about whether your future is larger than your past. And that's where we're going next. There's a quiet trap that most people don't recognize until it's already shaped decades of their life. It doesn't show up as failure. It shows up as memory. At some point, people stop describing who they are becoming and start only describing who they used to be. The best season, the best year, the best team, the best version of themselves that existed somewhere in the past. And at first it sounds harmless, even proud. But underneath it, something subtle is happening. Their identity has stopped moving forward. They're no longer building a life. They're curating a highlight reel. And when that becomes the dominant psychological pattern, life starts to shrink in ways people don't notice immediately. Not because they're incapable of growth, but because they're emotionally anchored to a version of themselves that no longer exists. This is the real danger of peaking early. Not that you had a peak, but that you start building your entire identity around protecting it. You start making decisions based on preservation instead of expansion. You avoid environments where you might not immediately stand out. You avoid conversations where you might not sound impressive. You avoid opportunities that require you to become a beginner again. And slowly, without realizing it, your life becomes organized around avoiding discomfort instead of pursuing development. That's where stagnation becomes structural, not emotional, structural. Because at that point, it isn't just a mindset issue. It's a life design issue. One of the most important distinctions in long-term performance is this. People who continue evolving are not protecting their past identity. They're updating it. They understand something that most people miss entirely. Their identity is not something you discover once. It is something you continuously rebuild. And if you refuse to rebuild it, life does it for you anyways, just without your input. This is where leadership becomes a reflection of identity maturity. You can always tell when someone is leading from their past versus leading from their present. Leaders anchored in past success tend to become rigid. They rely on authority earned years ago instead of relevance built today. They reference old wins instead of building new ones. They become protective of systems that they once created instead of curious about systems they could improve. And the cost is not just personal, it spreads. Because identity stagnation in leadership doesn't stay contained. It becomes culture. Teams start feeling it before they can name it. Innovation slows down. Conversations become repetitive. New ideas get filtered through old frameworks that no longer match reality. And slowly, the organization starts to mirror the leader's internal state. This is why legacy is not what you leave behind. Legacy is what you continuously build while you are still in motion. There's a difference between being remembered for what you did once and being respected for who you are consistently. One is frozen in time, the other evolves in time. And this is where the deeper question emerges. What happens when someone never leaves the emotional peak of their past? They start to measure every new experience against it. And nothing ever feels the same. Nothing ever feels as exciting. But the issue is not that life got worse. The issue is that they stopped growing into versions of themselves they can fully experience what's next. That's the hidden cost of staying loyal to a former self. You don't just lose progress, you lose perception. You lose the ability to recognize value in new environments because you're still emotionally negotiating with an old one. And over time, that becomes a kind of quiet identity imprisonment. Not dramatic, just limiting. There's a moment I've seen in high performers that stay consistent across athletes, executives, and entrepreneurs. They realize, sometimes late, that they have spent more energy protecting a version of themselves than building a new one. And that realization can either collapse them or wake them up. Because at that point, you're standing at a fork in identity. You can become a museum of your former self, or you can become something that is still under construction. The people who continue growing choose the second path. But it requires something most people avoid, letting old versions of yourself die without resentment. Not forgetting them, not rejecting them, but refusing to live inside them. That's where true identity evolution begins. And it's also where long-term greatness actually comes from. Not talent, not early success, not momentum, but the willingness to continuously become someone you have never been before. That is what keeps life expanding. And when you look at people who are still evolving decades after their peak, you'll notice something very consistent. They're not obsessed with their past. They're curious about their next self. They're not trying to relive their best years. They're trying to build better ones. They're not asking, when was I at my best? They're asking, what would it take to become better now? That shift is everything, because one question anchors you in memory, the other anchors you in possibility. And this is where the final integration matters. If you take everything from this episode, it distills down to one single decision. Do you want to preserve a chapter of your life or continue writing it? Because the tragedy is not that people peak early. The tragedy is that they never leave the peak emotionally. They just keep visiting it, replaying it, referencing it, living inside it, while the next version of their life waits for them to step forward. And this is where identity becomes either your ceiling or your engine. If your identity is built around who you were, you will always be trying to maintain it. If your identity is built around who you are becoming, you will always be expanding it. That is the entire divide, and it shows up everywhere. In leadership, in relationships, in performance, in discipline, in ambition, and how willing you are to be seen as a beginner again. And if there's one final truth that ties this entire episode together, it's this. Your best chapter is not something you find behind you. It is something you build in front of you. But only if you're willing to stop treating your past as the destination and start treating it as the foundation. Because the moment you stop trying to preserve who you were, you finally create space to become who you are capable of becoming. And that is where real legacy begins. Not in what you used to be known for, but in what you are still becoming. Resilient minds, premier results. That's what we're building here with the Premier Mindset, and our goal is to spread awareness because recognition is always the first step. If you don't see something happening, you can't do anything about it, which is why we share this information with as many people as possible, as many ways as possible, as free as possible. As always, this episode is meant to provide tools for performance, not to replace individualized therapy. If you're struggling with anxiety, burnout, or persistent stress, professional guidance is critical. At Premier Performance LLC, we work with high achievers to implement strategies like these with precision, accountability, and results. I make it a point to give you actionable tools to find success in your life. Let me know if it's helping. I love staying connected with you all. I want to hear about the successes, the failures, the disappointments, the hardships, and just how you overcame these things too. I like knowing what's going on and finding out if these things are helping you guys. So stay connected and let me know, positive or negative. I want to hear it all. I'd also love to hear how this episode specifically impacts you. If this does feel helpful, let me know. If it feels like there's things I could add to it, let me know. If there's someone in your life that you feel like could benefit from hearing this, share it with them and send it their way. It may be the exact thing they're waiting to hear, and it might kick them into gear and get some things going. With that, if you did find benefit from this, make sure to leave us a review. The more reviews we get, the better, as we can share this with more and more people, and our goal is to spread awareness. If you have any questions or issues, feel free to reach out. There are a lot of different ways you can reach out. You can email me at tmailer@premierperformancereno.com. My last name spelled Mahler. You can text or call me directly at 775-561-0056. The Instagram or the TikTok both have the same name, which is Premier_Performance_Reno for both of those. The Facebook page and LinkedIn page both have the same name, which is Premier Performance LLC for both of those. The Twitter or the X account is @PremierReno LLC. And then our website is www.premierperformancereno.com. So make sure to get involved. We have new content coming out on our social media sites literally every day. And we have new podcast episodes coming out every week. If you have any questions or issues, or you want to just work together, reach out and let me know. I'd love to connect and get some stuff started. Next week, we're going to actually jump into something a little different. And we're going to start to get into some more interviews. So we're going to go into some interviews with people that are in positions where they do impact performance in various ways. So that's what we're going to jump into next time. And I'll go over a quick bio at the beginning of the next episode to help you understand who the person is and why we're going into these things so you better understand the context of how that interview and that conversation is going to help you. So as normal, go be the best you can be, put yourself out there, do some things that scare you, and don't be afraid of the success that you could create in your life. Just go after it. Do the best you can, be the best you can be, and I will see you all next week as we keep going. I hope you all have a good one. I'll talk to you soon.